Get the latest Impact podcast right into your inbox each week. Subscribe by entering your email address at impactpodcast.com to make sure you never miss an interview. This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by ERI. ERI has a mission to protect people, the planet, and your privacy, and is the largest fully integrated IT and electronics asset disposition provider and cybersecurity-focused hardware destruction company in the United States, and maybe even the world. For more information on how ERI can help your business properly dispose of outdated electronic hardware devices, please visit eridirect.com. This episode of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by Closed Loop Partners. Closed Loop Partners is a leading circular economy investor in the United States with an extensive network of Fortune 500 corporate investors, family offices, institutional investors, industry experts, and impact partners. Closed Loop's platform spans the arc of capital from venture capital to private equity, bridging gaps and fostering synergies to scale the circular economy. To find Closed Loop Partners, please go to www.closedlooppartners.com. Welcome to another edition of the Impact Podcast. I'm John Shigarian, and I'm so honored to have with us today Stuart Poore. He's the Chief Environment Officer of Cognizant. Welcome to the Impact Podcast, Stuart.
Thanks, John. Great to be here.
And you are sitting today, Stuart, in UK, and I'm in Fresno, California. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, I'm down in Hampshire on the south of the UK.
Well, thanks for joining all the way across the pond with us today. It feels like you and I are sitting sort of next to each other in the same room. That's the beauty of technology. And we're going to get talking in a second about all the important things regarding the environment that you and your colleagues are doing at Cognizant. But before we get there, Stuart, can you share a little bit about your background? Where'd you grow up and how'd you get on this journey? That's very important and actually really helping make the world a better place.
Yeah, so thanks, John. The story for me started, certainly when it comes to sustainability anyway, started around sort of 2003. I'd spent a long time in academic life, getting a doctorate and teaching at a university and so on. And then I took a jump into the big wide world outside of academia. And I started out in an organization called WWF. I think in the US, it's still called the World Wildlife Fund. And that was around 2003. And I was doing some work in public affairs and campaigning at WWF. I think fair to say, generally regarded as the biggest environmental NGO in the world, one of the most credible, certainly. And my role was to run a series of campaigns around climate change, which was quite tricky at the time, given that climate change back in 2003 wasn't really quite so prominent on the agenda as it is now. But working across some other impact areas as well. And that really was my first taste of the environmental sustainability agenda. And I kind of got to grips with, because of the very credible scientific approach that WWF takes, I was able to really grasp the essence of the environmental challenge, both in terms of, the sheer sense of urgency facing the natural world and the crisis that it was already facing back in 2003. It is obviously in a much worse state now. But also, and perhaps more relevantly in terms of my subsequent career, the learning about the role of business in the environment. Businesses that need to manage their impact, but also come up with solutions to helping enhance sustainability. And so I took a view, having campaigned for a while at WWF. I wanted to see how things look from the other side. So hopping over the fence, working inside an organization and getting my hands on the levers of change where I could actually drive impact for myself and actually see an outcome. So that's what I did. And that led to a series of in-house corporate sustainability roles. I actually popped back to WWF back in 2016 for another stint, just to sort of rejuvenate myself a little bit. But I find myself today in Cognizant, large professional services business with a large impact of its own. And yeah, I've not really looked back since those early days. I would say the agenda's changed quite a bit from when I first started out. So when I was first working with businesses, the emphasis was much more around risk management and philanthropy.
Right.
Supporting the local community, what used to be called CSR, corporate social responsibility. In many ways, the agenda has kind of grown up. And I think that's largely as a consequence of rising expectations on business in view of the environmental crisis we're facing, a much greater pressure on businesses to be more transparent about the impacts they have and then to find solutions and risk management strategies for those impacts. And so I think business is much more sensitized to the agenda. You're seeing a very different type of person coming into these roles now, and lots of different roles within their organization. And so it sits much more fundamentally at the heart of the business model now than it did back in those early days for me.
What year did you join Cognizant?
So I joined Cognizant actually right in the middle of COVID.
Wow.
I left a large Japanese imaging technology business called Canon, which you may have heard of,
Sure.
camera and printers, and moved into the Cognizant around 2021. So yeah,
Wow.
I went from looking at a Canon screen one day to the next day looking at a Cognizant screen, but still sat in the same seat on one of those COVID switches.
Got it. And you came in as a chief environmental officer then?
That's right. Yes.
And was that the first time that role was filled, or were you stepping into shoes?
It was the first time that Cognizant had brought someone in to have a dedicated focus on environmental sustainability, for sure. I think there was a real appetite and recognition at senior levels in our organization that we needed to establish a clear plan on climate action and to put in place a net zero goal, which is what I was brought in to do. And so I think it was reflective. My hire was very much reflective of the business's appetite to want to get to grips with the climate agenda, both from the perspective of reducing emissions, but also trying to get our heads around this rising phenomenon of climate risk, physical and transition climate risk on the organization, and developing a transition plan in view of those wider changes.
And so, first of all, for our listeners and viewers who aren't familiar with Cognizant, I'm just going to macro tee that up, Stuart. It's the annual revenue is over 19 billion. The number of employees are over 350,000, and the number of countries served is about 35 countries Cognizant's in. So this is a big role. You guys are, a very big enterprise now, founded in 1994, now 30 years old or so. So this isn't just a small enterprise. This is quite a very big enterprise. What I always like to know, and you jumped ahead a little bit, which is great, you were ahead of me, is at the proverbial white page. You came in and you had that proverbial white page as the first to hold that role. How did you, obviously you hinted that net zero was one of the priorities. How did you create the list of priorities, and how has that gone but now that you have 3 years in arrears to look backwards a little bit, which is sometimes a clearer vision than looking forward. How did that work, and how is it working so far?
Yeah, you're right. I did have a blank sheet of paper when I arrived, but I think the business was always clear, and I just think to codify the fact that we're not a big manufacturing organization that's creating a lot of pollution and impact on site per se. We're not selling lots of product out there that's having an impact. We're a professional services organization. So we're all about the people that we hire and the expertise that they can take to our clients. So it felt fairly straightforward to emphasize the need for climate action. That really is where the organization could make the most progress and where its impact was acutest. And I'm thinking there in terms of the energy that we source for running our offices and our data centers, and the latter is certainly a challenge in terms of the advent of Gen AI. We'll perhaps come on to that a little bit later. And it's also about the travel that our 350,000 people undertake. Now, clients typically and much more now, given that we're out of COVID, fortunately. Demand often face-to-face relationships. And
Sure.
so we're under a lot of pressure to get on planes and fly. That has an impact. So when I looked across our profile, looked across the things we do, places we operate in, the things we sell, the climate agenda certainly felt like the most sort of pressing concern. And that's why my time has been dedicated to setting and then delivering against this net zero goal, which is very important to the organization. It underpins so much of what we do and what we care about in the world of corporate sustainability. And it also underpins our credibility in the market as a company selling sustainability solutions to our customers.
So when you set that goal, what particularly was set? When is your goal to get to net zero for Cognizant?
Yeah. So we've set a science-based target. In other words, a target that's aligned with the 2015 Paris Agreement, which is where we have the international consensus on the need to keep global average temperature increases to no more than 1.55 degrees. So our science-based plan is aligned with that need. And more practically, that boils down to needing to halve our emissions by 2030, so 50% reduction in our total gross emissions by 2030 on a 2019 baseline, and then a 90% reduction by 2040. Yeah, and that's a big concept, like 90% reductions in the course of 20 years. These are real reductions because we want to lean into real decarbonization and see carbon offsets, which typically many businesses have relied upon as a first priority to claim what used to be described as carbon neutrality. We're putting that as a last resort and focusing in as what the science-based target obligates us to focus on, real absolute reductions through, for example, increasing the amount of renewable energy, wind and solar, electricity generation that we use in our operations. We're going to be 100% clean energy sourcing by 2026. That's a big deal. Really doubling down on energy efficiency. So not just about the type of energy we use, but also the total that we consume. And looking at things like the heating, ventilation, air conditioning that we have in our offices, but also thinking about the power consumption in our data centers and making sure that's as efficient as possible. Cutting out wasteful travel. As I said, we have a footprint from air travel particularly, which we very much need to reduce. And then most importantly of all, because it accounts for the biggest bucket of our emissions, are the purchased goods and capital goods and services that we buy into the organization, which account for 50% of our total carbon footprint. That's in the Scope 3 kind of value chain based emissions. And that's involving a lot of engagement with our suppliers to try and reduce our emissions. I think it's fair to say, going back to my point earlier about how the agenda's grown up, there's been an increasing introduction of standardization in this space to help guide organizations like Cognizant on the path it needs to take to decarbonize. Most notably in this respect, I would give a mention to the Science Based Targets Initiative, which is a consortium of NGOs, including WWF, that are committed to setting the best standards and frameworks for businesses and other organizations to decarbonize. And that gives us a really nice framework through which to think about how we can ensure we stay on track with the science and reduce our emissions in line with the need to get to net zero.
It's your 50% goal by 2030 sounds very reasonable. 90% obviously sounds very, very audacious, which is I commend you. But you also it bears worth mentioning that this is while Cognizant's going to continue to grow. So in theory, your emissions would be growing on a net basis while you're trying to reduce them. You're really reducing them during still a growth. So talk a little bit about the challenges that all chief environmental or sustainability officers face with how do you grow a commercially viable and scalable business without growing its emissions while you're actually trying to cut them? How do you gently do that delicate dance and high wire act of working within your organization and getting buy-in from across all levels to not hinder the growth but to manage the emissions while the company continues to thrive and grow.
Yeah, I think you're touching upon the nub of the challenge here, this concept of decoupling commercial and emissions growth. This is the big conceptual challenge that keeps people like me up at night. and there's two ways that I try to encourage people to think about this in the organization and outside. Firstly, that investing in measures that decarbonize is a really obvious and easy way to reduce your operating costs, right? So by setting up, for example, long-term power purchase agreements for clean energy in India, where the bulk of our energy is consumed, we get to acquire energy at cheaper rates than if we were just going to the grid buying it on a business as usual basis. So straight away, our energy bills go down by setting up long-term fixed price deals with developers for clean energy, right? So energy bills going down, and then coupling that with investment in new equipment, retrofitting and upgrading old equipment that we use to heat and cool and ventilate our buildings. That pays for itself over a fairly short period, right? Our energy bills go down because we've got better equipment that uses electricity in a more efficient way. So this is first and foremost for me about an efficient operating model. I don't have to spend a huge amount of time telling the business that employees should fly less wastefully to our finance team. They're shoulder to shoulder with me on that message because it costs money to get on planes and fly.
Right.
It also costs emissions. So we're together on that. We've got to be a little bit careful with that argument because when times are good and margins aren't quite so tight, finance may be inclined, our team isn't, but finance may be inclined to walk away, wipe their hands and say, job done, leaving me to carry the emissions problem forward. But my central point here is that this is a way to save money. It's a way to address the bottom line. The other way to think about this is that the green transition, the shift towards a low carbon economy, is a huge revenue opportunity. Right? Clients are hungry for decarbonization solutions and circular solutions, but in the context of the conversation we're having, I'm thinking about decarbonization especially. That's why we set up a dedicated practice to support clients with their sustainability commitments. And to be able to really maximize revenue in that segment, we've got to walk the talk in our own backyard. Otherwise, we won't have any credibility in the market. We won't have any authenticity in the eyes of the client if we're not able to show that we're immediately pushing for net zero. Okay, so I see top and bottom line benefits.
Let's
all that said,
yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I just want to finish on the point though that as compelling as you may find those sort of those two arguments, it's also really important to point out this is really hard work, right?
Yeah.
Businesses that grow generally employ more people, they acquire more floor space, they travel more, and they buy more stuff. All of that inflates carbon footprints, and so it's it goes very much against the grain to bend the curve on emissions when you're looking to grow the physical footprint of your organization. So it's a really, really complex challenge.
Well, but you also just brought up to me one of the most important parts that sometimes doesn't even get raised or highlighted, and in many times gets cast aside, which is it's as good for business, the fact that you are dedicated as the chief environment officer and you're leading the way and walking the walk. Like you said, your practice at Cognizant, of course, the fun and the excitement of any business in any industry is to grow and scale and to continue to become a bigger success at what they do. You couldn't have the credibility. And like you said, your clients are asking for this consulting, for this guidance, for this leadership. But if you weren't doing it yourselves, there would be a huge disconnect that wouldn't lead to the growing of that part of the very growing practice that Cognizant has. So the fact that what you're doing actually leads to more growth, which you then still have to manage on the other side, is a fascinating paradox, but still one that needs to be not only be shared, but also highlighted, because it actually grows the business. It grows the business.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we have a phrase, I don't know if it's made its way across the Atlantic. We have a phrase, eating your own dog food.
That's true.
And that's how I tend to think of it. We've got to really shovel our own dog food back in order to be able to face up to the market and look credible.
Talk a little bit about the challenge, though. As you said, there's many initiatives that you've put in place to help, stabilize and reduce the net emissions at Cognizant. But the fact of the matter is, although you sit in the UK, you're doing business at least in 35 countries on numerous continents with, as you and I know, a patchwork quilt of challenges that come across with doing business across the planet, but also a patchwork quilt now of regulatory ideals that we're seeing here with Gary Gensler in the United States, that you're seeing in the EU and way beyond in LATAM and also in Asia. How do you manage that delicate dance of the patchwork quilt of commercial opportunities to reduce your emissions, number one, and also the regulatory frameworks that you face as you look across the planet?
Yeah, the main focus with regulation, as you and your listeners probably know, an organization like ours is around reporting. Yes. And the need for transparency in the way that we are impacting the natural world and communities, and getting much more granular in the data we provide to sort of tell the story around that. And you're seeing in, for example, the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, probably the most comprehensive piece of regulation of its type, a seismic shift really in the levels of disclosure that a company like Cognizant, which whilst listed in the US is operating in the EU and other markets, as you noted, needs to take in order to stay compliant. We're going through the analysis at the moment to be ready to comply with the CSRD, and you're forced to dig really deep and provide all sorts of information that organizations have not been asked to provide before. And then alongside that, and as you said, John, there's similar types of regulation, typically under the aegis of the ISSB, which has absorbed a bunch of other standards, lots of standards in this space, as you'll know, which other countries have aligned their own in-country reporting regulation with. Okay, and then you have the SEC climate rule and the stuff going on in California and all sorts of regulation popping up like mushrooms in a field. And we've got to try to track all of that. We've got to track the transposition of the EU CSRD in member states as well. And it's not a guarantee that each will be transposed in the same way according to the same timeframes. So we've got to look across 27 countries in the EU to determine what we need to do by when, alongside this other global patchwork quilt of regulation. A lot of it's very similar, but there are some subtle differences, and any company that just assumes a one-size-fits-all approach will potentially be in trouble. So my job and the job of others around me to keep a close eye on what's required and to ready the business to acquire the data with the right sorts of controls to ensure that the data is accurate, reliable, and comprehensive. That's not a given for big organizations, something we work really hard on, so that when we report a data point through our auditor to the market, you can really trust its veracity and its authenticity. So yeah, I do spend a lot of my time thinking about regulatory reporting, perhaps a little bit too much. I hear a lot of my colleagues expressing some disquiet at the amount of time dedicated to reporting at potentially the expense of actual change management and delivery. That's a worry. But I think at root, the concept of transparency which in turn can lead to accountability, is a good thing. We just need to get the balance right in terms of the way resources being deployed for it.
For our listeners and viewers who've just joined us, we've got Stuart Poore with us today. He's the Chief Environment Officer of Cognizant. To find Stuart and his colleagues and all the important work they're doing in the environment, please go to www.cognizant.com. Stuart, talk a little bit about external emissions, the emissions that sit with your suppliers. How do you champion your goals and your efforts with your suppliers and get them to go along and get aligned with your mission and your goals, so this way you can hit your goals at Cognizant?
Yeah, this is a big headache, not just for Cognizant or any company that's set itself a science-based target. Sure. It encompasses not just scope 1 and 2, but also what we call scope 3 emissions that sit in the value chain. A lot of people struggle with the idea of, really getting hold of emissions that other organizations are responsible for. And that's a big leap for companies to make. Nevertheless, we acknowledge that needs to be part of our footprint and therefore part of our reduction goal. And it's a big part of the footprint. It's nearly 50% of our total footprint.
Wow.
And so therefore we need suppliers on board, giving us two things really. One, their data on their footprint. Otherwise, we're relying on estimates to calculate what they generate. And two, we need reduction commitments from them. So we need them setting science-based targets for reduction that we will start to see follow through into our footprinting over time. And really, for me, it's about not trying to boil the ocean in the early stages. So we've got thousands of suppliers, literally. I do not have the resource to go after every one of those suppliers and persuade them to give us data and set reduction targets. So instead, we focus on the relationships that generate the biggest emissions. And our top 150 suppliers account for about 65% of our total emissions. So that's where we've really dedicated our focus. And yeah, it's about collaborating with them for those that are less mature and less appreciative of the requirements to help them realize the benefits that can be enjoyed, those benefits I talked about earlier in terms of top and bottom line, but also to emphasize to them the need for a values alignment. This is something that really matters to Cognizant.
Right.
We haven't spent the time and energy that we have into setting a net zero goal and gone through the pain of making real progress towards that goal. And 47% reduction in emissions since 2019. That's no mean feat. Okay, COVID's had some bearing on that, but we've made really solid progress. We didn't want to walk those hard yards and not have our partners come with us on that journey. We want them to really come with us, hearts and minds, and align. So we're seeing it very much as a license to do business with Cognizant, just as many other big organizations are. Many big clients have demanded from us too. It's not like we're alone, a canary in the coal mine on this. We're very much alongside our big partners, big businesses that we work alongside, for example, Microsoft, Salesforce, Google, and others. They will demand the same from us, and we will be pushing that down to our suppliers. And we've actually put some teeth into this as well by virtue of a clause that we put into new contracts with certain types of suppliers that obligates them to give us the data and set targets. So it's a mixture of carrots and sticks. It's easier in some parts of the world and with certain types of suppliers than it is others. Some suppliers are really just struggling to get onto the starting blocks, let alone get off them and move forward. Others are already there, been doing this before Cognizant, and so we're able to learn from them as much as they are to listen to us. So there's a real spectrum of different players in this space. But it is the next big frontier in the world of decarbonisation. Getting to grips with your scope 3 emissions and specifically this big challenge of goods and services that you buy into your organization.
That's interesting. Stuart, I failed to ask you earlier. You've been there at Cognizant for 3 years now. Do you guys does Cognizant produce and your team produce an annual environmental impact report that gets published?
Yeah, we do. We've been producing, a substantive ESG report now for about the last 3 years. And we include in that data that's been subject to limited assurance by our auditor of record. So it's a very carefully thought through carefully constructed forward disclosure that stakeholders can really trust for its accuracy and reliability. So yes,
And
please do check out the report on our website. We'll be publishing another one next year. Of course, a lot of this will be shaped in the future by the new reporting requirements that I mentioned earlier, but we've already got ahead of those requirements in so many ways and disclose a lot of the stuff that the regulation would demand of us anyway.
And it lives in perpetuity up on cognizant.com.
Correct.
Got it. There's not a day, Stuart, that you sitting in the UK or me sitting here in California turns on our telly and sees either BBC or CNBC or Bloomberg or any of the other great broadcast channels, and we don't read or learn about or hear broadcasting information about AI, the great AI revolution. How is AI? Is AI overhyped a little bit? We're going through a hype cycle with it now. Is it overhyped a little bit? And what's its application to the greater goals of most organizations, great organizations like Cognizant around the world that are in a race now to decarbonize? Is a net positive, a net negative, or sort of benign to the process?
Truthfully, I'd say the jury's out.
Okay.
Which might sound like a strange thing to say from someone working in a Gen AI-driven business, but we should remind ourselves that yes, it's there. It's omnipresent in the news, but it is still only a couple of years since this stuff was really landing in any sort of meaningful operation sense. So it's a little bit too early to tell. I think there are obviously upsides and downsides. I'll focus on the upsides firstly.
Okay.
It is undoubtedly a tool. AI present tools that can accelerate decarbonization. For example, they're optimizing energy consumption in a large operation, and also as a way of improving and enhancing adaptation to the worst impacts of the climate crisis. So understanding, forecasting extreme weather events more effectively. For someone like me, the potential there is hugely seductive and one that I really want to grab, because I need to know what the future looks like to be able to encourage the business to think about the impact that these worrying trends physically in the physical world will have on our people and our operations and our supply chain as well. So enormous potential there to make our jobs easier, to give us better data, better insights into how.
So let's pause there. So net positive on the predictive analytics that it offers. Got it.
Yes.
Okay, keep going.
That's right.
Got it.
Yeah. There's a but, of course, and the but, which is increasingly well documented, is that to provide Gen AI solutions, you need a hell of a lot of computing power. Right? That would improve as AI turns in on itself and becomes more efficient. But as things stand, you're going to need a lot of computing power, which means you're going to need a lot of energy consumption in data centers, a lot of water to keep data centers cool as well. So to give AI hungry clients what they need. Okay. And we don't need to look very far for some pretty clear and compelling evidence of the impact it's having. Look at recent announcements from Microsoft and Google about the way in which Gen AI is already blowing their carbon budgets. And you can see just how material this Gen AI introduction is on carbon footprinting. And the way I tend to think about the sort of the more immediate mechanisms for combating this are, there's nothing novel about this, but worth stating nonetheless. Firstly, we've got to ensure that data centers are powered with as much clean energy as possible, right? The good news is that the big hyperscalers, including the aforementioned, are investing very significantly in AI, but coupling that with a significant scale investment into clean energy generation as well. And interestingly, I think only this week, Google announced this, looking at some nuclear power solutions for data centers in the US. Right. So I think wouldn't say the pennies drop, but there's a clear realization that Gen AI equals more power consumption means immediately double down on your renewable energy generation if you want to ensure that this remains low carbon. And I think it's also about thinking sensibly about the siting of data centers in view of water stress and the need to ensure good water stewardship, because depending on the technology you're using with data centers, you may need to consume quite significant quantities of water to manage the operation. So let's think about where these operations are sited to ensure that they're not adding stress to already troubled river basins. So I need to think really, really carefully about those two things. And then the third thing I would say, added to that, and that's fairly obviously, we need to think about applying green engineering solutions to the data center operations themselves. So thinking about how AI can be used by itself to manage power consumption, manage peak rates of consumption in line with other energy requirements across the grid to ensure that energy is consumed in an optimal and efficient way using sensors and monitors and various other techniques, some weird and wonderful tech jargon like hyperconvergence and containerization, virtualization, sorts of techie IT stuff, which my colleagues can tell you much more about than I. But there's lots of different ways, and the solutions are growing exponentially for ensuring energy efficiency across these increasingly stressed out and in-demand data centers. So, as I say, still early days. I think we're learning all the time. It's fast learning. It's machine-to-machine learning by definition. But I think what we can say with confidence is that there's a clear sense of understanding and appreciation that Gen AI does not come without its costs and impacts. If you're assuming a sort of BAU operational approach, it's got to be coupled with a full suite of decarbonization solutions along the way.
Makes sense. We talked earlier about you starting in 2021 and prioritizing the net zero emission goals of 2030 and 2040 that you've set. Talk a little bit about the other alphabet soup of issues and topics that you, as a chief environment officer, are forced to also juggle and prioritize at large organizations such as Cognizant, such as DEI, ESG, the shift from the linear to circular economy. How do you prioritize those, and where do you put them in the hierarchy of issues that you're working on as you continue to just overall create the best suite of goals that are possible?
Yeah, so within the context of environment, which is my area of concern, we can't just think about emissions. We've also got to think about water and waste,
right,
and biodiversity as well. Now,
Sure.
Now this is, I think it's fair to say, a less impactful area for Cognizant, where we're not running big manufacturing operations. So our levels of water consumption and waste generation are relatively low. Nevertheless, the regulations I described earlier, the reporting regulations, among other things, demands much higher levels of transparency and better data to report on our impacts. So, and as I said, water is a pressing concern from a data center operation perspective anyway. So thinking hard about the locations of our sites, the amount of water we consume, and where that coheres with high levels of water stress in high risk river basins, that's something which I need to spend time on. On the waste side, the big area of concern for me is actually e-waste. As an IT organization, it's incumbent upon us to be managing our hardware, although we don't produce any of our own. We have 350,000 people using laptops every day of the week and mobile phones. And we've got to make sure that we ensure that none of that stuff goes to landfill. And so we've set, in the last 6 months, we've set a goal to ensure that zero e-waste ends up in landfill by 2030. We're already at very, very high percentages that don't. And part of the reason for that is that most of our e-waste is generated in India, which is where 250 of our 350,000 associates are based. And the rules governing e-waste disposal there are pretty tight. And so we have, even if we wanted to, we don't have any wiggle room in terms of irresponsibly disposing of equipment. Nevertheless, we're trying to ensure that we're as circular as possible with our IT operations, that we're bringing stuff back as much as possible, refurbishing it, redeploying it. I'm talking to you from a refurbished laptop. The business very kindly polished up for me, and I'm very happy to be doing so rather than procuring a brand new laptop, which some people are still wanting, but we have to sort of punch through that mindset and encourage them to think about the fact that just because it's got a few scratches, still a perfectly workable and effective machine. So there's a bit of a cultural shift required there, but also making sure that we're utilizing as many different routes outside the organization as possible, not just providing it to established e-waste management vendors. It's also providing it to local communities in India that can properly benefit from the use of perfectly functional and high quality IT hardware that for whatever reason we just decided we no longer need to use. So yeah, e-waste and water are the two big areas when it comes to circular economy that we think about with regard to climate, and try to think about the interconnectivity between these areas, because water, waste and climate increasingly need to be recognized as a nexus of concerns, all under the umbrella of sustainability, and with obviously with social justice as a wraparound for all of that, to ensure that we're delivering a just transition, a socially just transition to low carbon, low waste societies.
Stuart, I have to give you a compliment, because I've done now almost 2,000 of these interviews over 20 years. And it's very heartening for me now after 20 years of this journey, as you said, and you and I are the sort of OGs in this whole space. We've seen as you said, from the top of the conversation, we've seen the shift go from sort of philanthropy and just, sort of nice green environmental work to a much more complex world that we live in today. And of course, with all the complex issues that we've been discussing. But I've never interviewed yet until you, which thank gosh for you, a chief sustainability or environmental officer who has highlighted both water and electronic waste, which of course I know something about the electronic waste side. And the other thing that comes with the electronic waste is the inherent risk now that didn't exist when you and I started our journeys 20 or so years ago, of cybersecurity and data protection as well. And that also is with over 300,000 employees and laptops and gadgets that they're working on and continuing to drive the success of Cognizant and the growth of Cognizant. That's just another risk, because it's not only their own the data of Cognizant, but it's the goodwill and the data of your Fortune 100, 200, and 300 clients that you get to service around the world. So that issue of e-waste is, I couldn't agree with you more, but kudos to you being the first to mention that and highlight that, and it gives me hope. It gives me hope that we're headed in the right direction. You also have an academic background in international politics. We didn't talk about today the externalities of policy and regulation with regards to shaping sustainability efforts for organizations and countries around the world. How much does policy and regulation really play a role in this shaping, or is it more self-driven from companies like Cognizant, or is it a happy balance? Where do you see policy and regulation falling now as to the future of decarbonization and the world sort of cooling off a little bit and getting into a better place?
The answer to that question varies depending which day you talk to me on. You could one day you could speak to me when I've had a client on the phone demanding clarity on our country specific emissions here, or our climate risk plan there, or investors be on the phone wanting to know about our approach to renewable energy sourcing, and it feels very much like a growth engine, like a commercial growth engine, like something that the business wants to deliver on because it matters to our brand, to our values, and to our client proposition, right? And then other days, I'll be looking at the EU taxonomy and the ESRS, and then the ISSB standard as it's playing out in somewhere in the Far East, and I'll be reminded of just how compelling the case for regulatory compliance is from the perspective of time spent and resource supply. And so it ebbs and flows. And the truth of it is, very obviously, it's a combination of both, right? The regulatory landscape, largely led by, but not only the European Union, is unquestionably shifting as policymakers grapple with and tune into the need to transition to low carbon, low waste economies, without question. And then that sort of ripples through. There's a symbiotic relationship, of course, between that and then what businesses will demand of us as clients, what investors will expect of us as organizations prepared to put capital into us. You know, they're responding to the same signals, and that all of that kind of wraps up and snowballs into a package that we need to respond to. I think there is unquestionably a conversation that I'm witnessing from the other side of the Atlantic in the US about the role of ESG and the importance that organizations should attach to it and what it represents and sits behind it, which I watch with interest, sometimes with amusement. But I think if you take the long game here and you start to recognize the enormous opportunity that green growth can bring to organizations, well, not just an organization, to communities, to countries around the world, then it becomes much less political and much more of a commercial imperative in many ways. So it has changed enormously from those early days when I first got involved, and where it was really about the hearts and minds and the do the right thing approach, very sort of altruistic, which I don't think really tunes into what businesses are set up to do and how they typically operate. We respond to markets and we respond to growth and commercial consideration. And we have that now. We have that consideration in front of us. And it's just about capitalizing upon it and making sure that we're optimizing it in ways that's good for us, but also good for people and for the planet.
That's wonderful. Stuart, I want to end with a question that's really important. If I was your biographer and I was writing a book on your career, and you're going to be advising in this book to other corporate leaders who are looking to enhance their organizations or companies' sustainability practices. Now that since I dubbed you earlier, one of the sustainability or environmental OGs, that you've been doing it a long time. You were late on the train. You were early on the train. What would you say, if I was your biographer, what are your 3 to 5 key lessons to other sustainability leaders out there that are faced with all the complex challenges that you're faced with at large organizations across continents around the world? What are some of the great lessons and takeaways that you'd like to share with the leaderships out there that are looking for advice and for guidance?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, as an overarching principle, is to remind ourselves that this is the critical decade. Now, there is no room for soft pedaling, complacency, or stepping back. We need to show courage as sustainability practitioners, and we need to push the leaders in our organization to recognize the enormous opportunities that the green economy presents for us. And we need to do it in a way that's socially just and equitable. So we need courageous people, smart people that can roll up their sleeves and get in there where it hurts to get the job done. So that's my sort of overarching principle. I would say when it comes to sort of making progress, if you follow the Cognizant example and one that I've adopted elsewhere across the organizations we've worked in, I think it's important to stress the need not to try and do everything on sustainability. These big reporting frameworks typically, adopt a wide variety of KPIs and lead you towards a kitchen sink based approach to reporting, and by definition, therefore management. And I think there's a danger that distracts organizations from the really important clutch of issues that matter most to your business in terms of the impact you have. So focus in, zero in on the things that matter most, and put in place a plan to address that. Work hard with political intelligence to get the right stakeholders on board, get your leadership teams on board. If you don't have your CEO on board, then you're likely dead in the water pretty quickly. So you've got to get into the upper echelons of the business, get the C-suite on side, persuade them of the merit of addressing these issues, and everything will then follow. And don't demur from the principle of transparency and accountability. Be clear who's doing what in the organization, what their roles and responsibilities are, and then communicate the hell out of it, engage your stakeholders so that you're learning from and iterating with them on the solutions required to change. So that's the fuse of what my head thoughts. It's hard work. It's, yes, the agenda's changed, it's grown up, but it's no less hard work now than it was. It's just the terms of the debate changed, the stakes have gone up, and the ability to wait and see just doesn't really exist anymore. We've got to get stuck in, and we've got to get stuck in fast.
That's so true. But man, those are really wise words. Stuart, thank you for joining us today. For our listeners and viewers, to find Stuart and his colleagues at Cognizant, please go to www.cognizant.com. Stuart, thank you for the time you spent with us today. Your words of wisdom are well taken and very important for our listeners and viewers to hear. But more importantly, thank you for all the great work that you and your colleagues at Cognizant are doing to make the world a better and more sustainable place.
Thanks, John. It's nice to hear, and it's been a pleasure to be with you today.
This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by Engage. Engage is a digital booking platform revolutionizing the talent booking industry. With thousands of athletes, celebrities, entrepreneurs, and business leaders, Engage is the go-to spot for booking talent, for speeches, custom experiences, live streams, and much more. For more information on Engage or to book talent today, visit letsengage.com. This edition of the Impact Podcast is brought to you by ERI. ERI has a mission to protect people, the planet, and your privacy, and is the largest fully integrated IT and electronics asset disposition provider and cybersecurity-focused hardware destruction company in the United States and maybe even the world. For more information on how ERI can help your business properly dispose of outdated electronic hardware devices, please visit eridirect.com.